Okay, now in this particular project that I mentioned before, we did a series of case studies that are quite interesting and relevant to the current situation. Regions that were in the past lagging and they managed to turn around. So I'm going to talk about two case studies and how they managed to do this with a bit more of a story behind it, some of the policy elements that they used. One is the northern Spanish region of Asturias. This region was far away from all the markets. Spain joined the European Union, and there was a lot of connectivity and infrastructure investment in this region that they managed to connect it with the external markets, both from west to south, from north to east. But also infrastructure was carried with an airport that if you fly into Oviedo, you'll find that there's a very good connectivity with the three main regions. You can find a bus leaving every 10 minutes. It takes you into 30 minutes time to all the three places. They have just built a port and the first highway that exists in the sea highway. And I didn't know what a sea highway was until we went there and they told us what it was. It's essentially a highway that takes goods from Asturias all the way to the north of France on a regular basis. So they managed to improve their infrastructure investment vis-a-vis Spain and vis-a-vis the OECD. And they also did this in combination with human capital. They improved both the percentage of high-skilled workers in the labor force and the absence of low-skilled workers. But most important with these critical elements for growth was the leadership changes that took place in the region. It was a region that had a lot of mining, a lot of heavy steel and coaling in the past, and there was a lot of social conflict amongst the mining unions with the business representatives. And the mayor of Gijón, he kind of did an agreement. He brought all the people to the table, sat them together, and everybody was able to start talking with each other, and kind of that helped to achieve sort of some peace within the different stakeholders. And that appears to be a very, very critical element to their turnaround story, is the ability to resolve conflict, resolve different points of view into a negotiation process, a table of where the different key holders met, discussed, and that appeared to be mobilizing the different people in the region. So that was a very interesting analysis that we carried, and as a result of that, Asturias has been catching up vis-a-vis Spain, vis-a-vis the OECD, and they've doubled their exports in about 12 years' time. The second story that I would like to display is a case study we did in Brandenburg. Brandenburg is kind of the donut region around Berlin, and all the eastern German regions, they experienced a tremendous restructuring from a communist closed economy to an open economy. And what's very interesting about this region is that at the beginning of the restructuring process, they had high expectations of becoming a sort of a competitiveness center. They thought that a lot of the businesses would relocate, a lot of the Western German businesses will relocate there because they had lower wages. A lot of the people from the East would move there in terms of opportunities, but it didn't happen. A lot of the investment went to Hungary, went to Poland, and nothing was left in the Eastern German. And a lot of the people that moved into the East moved to the West, where the wages are higher. So they were left with all their industrial structure was obsolete, and they had very, very much difficulties with some of the data that they told us are astonishing, like about 80% of the people in Brandenburg changed jobs. 40% of the housing was sort of like changed hands, was taken by the government and repossessed. 30% unemployment at the beginning. So it's a region that faced a lot of difficulties, and it received a lot of amounts of transfer from the national, from the western part, but also from the European Union. But and that put them into this dependency relationship with respect to the West. But what's interesting about their turnaround story is that they were able to change this mentality of dependency to one where they tried to build upon their own assets. And how do they do this? There was a lot of initiatives from from the local people to communicate with all the different actors. But there was a very important policy change. What they did is they identify 12 growth poles in the region. These growth poles are areas where they saw had the highest potential for development. And they were kind of trying to look at their main winners and compensate them and give them preferential financing treatment. What this did is it changed the mentality around. And what's important for them is that they didn't choose one or two locations. They kind of spread out across the entire territory. And they kind of said, okay, if you do well, they send a strong signal. If you do well, if you keep your things in order, you will receive preferential financing. So that was critical in their side to change the mentality of, if you actually, instead of wait from the national point of view to receive subsidies, if you look at your own assets and try to develop your own competences, that brings far greater returns than these dependency traps. So that was a very, very interesting story in Brandenburg. And as a result, they've been able to catch up with respect to Germany and with respect to the OECD as well. So these two stories, of course, they're context-specific. Leeds has also a different context. And something important is that there's not a magical formula that works in all places. The important part is to try to find out what your strengths, what your weaknesses are. Try to work with complementarities in the different areas. There's a very big danger if you operate under what we call silos, sectorial silos. And there's one that is known as the linking by leaking problem, already identified by Hirschman about 50 years ago, a famous economist. And this is when a place just focuses on infrastructure. If you just think about infrastructure as the main driver of growth in isolation to everything else, you might get unintended consequences, which is what happened in the south of Italy. The north connected with the south, thinking it would help the south. The south all of a sudden saw that, oops, they had a good connection to the south, and they could just supply all the goods to the consumers in the south, while all the firms ended up moving to the north. So there was like an unintended consequence of the original policy. These things happen when they operate under silos. The second one is this brain drain phenomenon. If you just focus on human capital and do not focus on the business environment, on connectivity, the other elements that I've been talking about, people will leave. If there's no opportunities for them, they will just leave. So what we think is the key, or something that we find that brings growth, is this integrated approach. This approach that takes all these different elements into one piece, and it tries to develop a strategy around these different elements, around the infrastructure, the connectivity, accessibility, human capital formation, but also the business environment. Once this bundle is together, then you can receive the type of complementarities that we see bring development and bring growth to places. Now, this is a very complex thing to do. And here I'll talk a little bit about the policies and the governance that are relevant to this approach. It has to involve the actors within the region. It's a combination between a bottom-up and a top-down approach. It has to build around diagnostics. Places need to understand what their strengths, what their weaknesses are. They have to develop a strategy where everybody moves to that objective stated in the strategy. So there's not a single way to do this, but there are important gaps that are very, very relevant to the current situation now. For example, administrative gap. What does that mean? When the area of intervention is different than the effective size or the economic size of places. And here's an advantage that the new institutional arrangement here has. It has that flexibility to define the area that it wants to operate. Information gap, it's critical to communicate things amongst the different players. There needs to be a platform, a way where people come to the table and information is shared, both horizontally across the different sectors, but also from the local to the national. It needs to be vertical communication so that all the policies can be in line, but also horizontal. These things need to be in place. There needs to be a good channel of communication. Policy gap, how to avoid fragmentation and this silos effect. There needs to be some mechanisms that combines the different policies operating in the region. This can be done through it's done in various forms, but there needs to be something in place that combines these different elements. Capacity gap. This will be a very critical element for this region. Who's going to be doing the assessment and analysis? Who's going to know which are the areas of strength, which are the future objectives? That has to be done with comparative, but not just with the national benchmarks. With other regions, if Leeds wants to become a global competitor, it needs to benchmark itself to other global competitors, see what they're doing. Where are the areas that Leeds is lagging behind? So it's very important, this capacity gap in the strategic assessment and design of policy phase, which is right now, but also in the delivery of policy. That's an area that will be very, very important under the new changes that are taking place. Funding gap. This is a critical area right now that raises a lot of questions, which I will not address, but it's very concern to everybody here. How are we going to get the proper funds to do the things that we would like to do? And objective gap. The objectives have to be aligned amongst the different stakeholders in the region and the objectives of the national policymakers as well. So these are some of the kind of elements that I would encourage, or some of the potential dangers that you might face in trying to implement or trying to change the institution and move forward. And finally, I would just like to show to you what we call this paradigm shift that we have been observing in the OECD member countries, and that is this kind of a place-based approach based on transfers and subsidies to one where slowly local actors are seeing that they actually have a say to what they want to do, and actually they have they're responsible for their own development, and that's really something many interesting lessons we see of regions. They do things and it works for them. It's not about just sitting down and trying to get funds from the national government, but mobilizing all these assets can really make a difference, and that involves all the elements that I've been talking before. So I think with that, I'll close my presentation.